Hello, friends. So, I finished Anti-Oedipus. Yay! Do I understand it? I don't know. Maybe. I'm going to talk about it today. Sort of go over my thoughts on the whole book, mostly the final 2 chapters, because I already made a part 1 video about the sort of first half of the book. Totally go watch that, especially if you're confused about the body without organs, because I go over that mostly there. But yeah, I have a lot to talk about because I have sort of scattered thoughts on this. I think I have a very good surface level understanding of this book, but I don't necessarily understand all of the inner workings. In any case, the main thing I want to provide an explanation for is desiring production, because that's, along with the body without organs, desiring production is kind of the main core, one of the main core aspects of this book. And it's a very abstract concept and kind of difficult to understand. So I want to at least explain my grasp of it. The first thing to understand is that Deleuze and Guattari separate Oedipal desire from schizophrenic desires, which is kind of the clashing of what's going on here. Oedipal desire is desire with lack. It is the desire that manifests itself under capitalism. And that means it is always a desire of an object. So you can think of it, instead of desiring production, it's desiring object. This would be like kind of a typical conception of desire, in the sense that I don't have something, therefore I desire it, right? Pretty easy to understand. Schizophrenic desire, desiring production, is desire as a pure creative force. You can think of it similar to the will to power in Nietzsche. It's sort of just this force that exists within all people, within all, and drives us constantly. But it's inherently a desire from production. So it doesn't desire any specific thing. It simply exists for itself alone. So to desire production is to simply desire the process of living. The process of living is production. We are always producing something. Life is always production. So desiring production is simply desiring the process of life. That's the way I understand it, in the most sort of philosophical way, sort of taken out of the context of all of the political and metaphysical inner workings of this idea. And it seems to me that the sort of thesis of this book is that Oedipus, which is the framework that we're trapped in currently under the state and under capitalism, we must escape Oedipus. And the only way to escape Oedipus is to, in fact, realize that we are not defined by Oedipus. We do not have to be Oedipal desire. And in fact, we are desiring production. We are desire itself. And the way that we reach this realization is also fundamentally sort of escaping our ego and realizing that we are not singular souls or egos inside of our head, but that we are multiplicity and fluidity. We are sort of everything, in a way. I mean, this follows very in line with a lot of the ego death philosophies, especially sort of like Eastern philosophies. Again, at least that's the way that I interpret it. I think that Deleuze and Guattari's idea of schizophrenia and of they're also not advocating that people become literally schizophrenic. They're just using schizophrenic people as models for a schizophrenic mindset, a mindset of ego death, and a mindset of desiring production, if that makes a lot more sense as well. I found a lot of this also very similar to the sort of Spinozan idea of the universal substance. And I know that Deleuze takes a lot of inspiration from Spinoza. He does mention Spinoza a few times about this book. So that's also a good point of reference, just something to grab onto, maybe a more easier concept in order to kind of get at exactly what Deleuze is talking about. Honestly, I think that a lot of the language in this book is so abstract that it's just, I think that it could be dumbed down and said in easier terms, especially because I think that this has a lot of extremely interesting revolutionary ideas that I would think it would be nice if more people could read this and this could be more accessible to more people, but it is just a very, very not accessible book. I found the third chapter specifically, I think it's called Savages, Barbarians, and Civilized Men. I found that to be particularly sort of incomprehensible. I can't say I got a whole lot out of that chapter. I wouldn't say skip it if you're reading this, although you can. Like, you're not going to miss anything necessarily by not skipping it, but there are parts of it that I think are quite insightful, especially as it gets more specifically into the capitalism nature of everything. It's just a lot of that chapter, a big part of that chapter went way over my head, so I don't really have a lot to say about that. But one insight I found particularly profound is the idea that the state has to continuously reinvent itself and continuously sort of destroy itself in order to perpetuate its existence. On page 215, he says that the state sees to it that the name is succeeded by another name, one dynasty by another, without changing the signifieds and without a collapse of the wall of the signifier. So there's sort of some Lacanian language here, but essentially the idea of the state as a metaphysical entity always stays present in the minds of the subjects. And so as these dynasties or successive leaders are killed and then or brought out of power and new ones are brought into power, it creates this idea that there is nothing beyond the state. It's just sort of an eternal, immortal process where different successive things gain power. And the state sort of hides behind this illusion of there's a change in power when in fact its ultimate power is always being manifested. I hope that I sort of explained that well enough. But this idea that the state sort of becomes a necessity in the minds of the people by its process of continually rebirthing itself under different power structures is just so... It spoke to me, especially as an anarchist, and it's almost kind of scary as a concept, but it makes a lot of sense. It sort of puts into perspective why everything functions the way it does. There needs to be progress, or at least the illusion of progress within a state apparatus in order for it to survive. Which also gives a lot more clarity to the quote that it's brought up a few times throughout this book, but sort of this idea that in order to function, the social machine must not function well. So it must have the illusion of not functioning in order for it to maintain its immortality. Another interesting idea was the sort of concept that, at least this is my interpretation of it, but that capitalism it benefits by being a very free enterprise, in the sense that its illusion of freedom allows for a lot of anti-capitalist activity, and you would think this would be counterintuitive to its goals. You'd think it would want to maintain this very strict authoritarian disciplinary control over everything, but in fact by allowing things to almost be against the system, capitalism expands its limits and encompasses these things within its system. That by itself just leaves you with a lot to think about. And sort of the idea that capitalism is this ultimate limit expanding thing. It's always reaching these outer limits, but never getting to the full limit. The limit being desiring production, which is sort of one of the main concepts explored here, this idea of limits. But the fact that capitalism can always expand its limits and encompass more and more things is sort of the ultimate power of capitalism, and why capitalism feels so universal. It's why many or most of these revolutions, especially like Marxist-Leninist revolutions, end up regressing just back into capitalism once more, because capitalism has enveloped it in its structures, in its system of Oedipal desire. as long as we remain with an Oedipal desire, we can never truly escape capitalism. And so schizophrenia is quoted, they say that it's capitalism's divergence and its death, because it cannot be absorbed within capitalism. It is the true position that is antithetical to capitalism, because it frames desire as desiring for production itself, desiring for the process itself instead of desiring an object, which is how all of our society currently is built. And this is why they also note that even one emergence, one substantiation of true desire is enough to destroy the entire system. They say this a few times throughout the book. And that gets to this other thing that they say a lot throughout the book, which is like the saying, we haven't seen anything yet. Because to defeat capitalism and to truly escape the situation that we're in, we need something much greater than just a shift in power, than just a shift in the material conditions of the world. We need a deeply philosophical change in our very perspective of life, in our very relationship to the world itself. Now, besides that, and I found that to be the most sort of the biggest takeaway for me, it's something that I'd been formulating in my own mind for a bit, but I very much like the way that they express it in this book, and it's an idea that I have not seen expressed in anything before. If you've read anything that expresses ideas very similar to that, I would absolutely love recommendations, by the way, because I'm very fascinated in that view of revolution as a more deeply philosophical shift and metaphysical shift rather than just one of power structure. In any case, there's just a few more observations I made that I found fascinating. The first is this idea which we see on page 254, where they say, quote, "There are no longer even any masters, but only slaves commanding other slaves. There is no longer any need to burden the animal from the outside. It shoulders its own burden." What's so interesting about this is that capitalism, specifically through this constant, which we see in Marx, this constant desire for capital and this constant desire to produce capital, which encompasses everyone within the capitalist system, essentially means that there isn't a class of people that are able to escape the machinery of capitalism and who make it run and who control it. It maintains itself through the fact that everyone within capitalism is a slave to capital, even the higher class of capitalists, which I think is what they mean when Deleuze and Guattari say that there is only one class. So it's not that there's workers that are slaves to the masters who control them, but those masters themselves are even slaves to the greater master, which is capital itself. So everyone essentially is a slave within capitalism, which I really think is a very notable idea. And furthermore, they make an observation about capitalism that I can't fully wrap my head around, but I do think is probably important. They show how in capitalism, the familial, private world is separated from the social. So there's the social world, which is capitalism, the government as the authority, and then there's the familial private world where the parents are the authority over the child. And so they both sort of reflect each other, but they are in fact separated. And I don't know exactly why this is such an important thing, but it does seem to me that Deleuze and Guattari are trying to point out that what we need to do is do away with that separation, which is inherently sort of an Oedipal framework, and understand everything as being collective. And perhaps this goes back to sort of a Spinozan universality, but everything being collective is clearly essential to the anti-Oedipal standpoint. And I know I'm jumping around here, I'm sorry about that. I just had a lot of ideas that don't necessarily connect to each other. Sort of the final thing that I found fascinating is the appearance of Kierkegaard's three modes. They don't mention it explicitly, but it seems very implicitly connected to that idea. So if you're not familiar, Kierkegaard has three modes of life, which is the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. And the aesthetic is we'll start with the ethical is always comparing themselves, or they place their life in a standpoint always to an external force or authority. The social, essentially, is what they're always relating themselves to, whereas the aesthetic is more of an internal thing where you're only driven by your personal desires and merely fulfilling your personal desires. And then the religious is for Kierkegaard, is the final leap of faith. How that manifests in Deleuze is that the aesthetic mode almost represents the desire with lack, the Oedipal desire, the constantly sort of striving after things because you want them. And that aesthetic mode is what manifests within capitalism. And it's still subjectivity, which is key here. Capitalism maintains itself very well because it takes hold of this subjectivity. Because we can never relate ourselves to an objective thing, because we are subjective beings. So we must look inward, is what Kierkegaard says. But if we look inward and we start still trying to desire things that are outside of us, or just appeasing our own will, then we are living subjectively, but not truly inwardly. But schizophrenic production, desiring production, very closely maps to the religious mode of living, where you simply desire life for the process itself. You simply desire the momentary experience of your subjective existence, therefore truly embracing inwardness. And that is what Kierkegaard calls faith. I haven't heard anyone compare Deleuze and Kierkegaard before, but I found that to be a pretty close mapping onto what Deleuze is saying here. And I'd love to hear other people's opinions on that, especially if you've read some Kierkegaard. I really do find that Kierkegaard's three modes of living appear in a lot of places just because they are very useful concepts. So, and I will definitely talk about Kierkegaard in a later video, probably a video coming soon. But in any case, that pretty much sums up my thoughts. I know this was sort of a scatterbrained review of this book, but yeah, it's a crazy book. It's a really unlike anything I've ever read before. I do think it's too long. It has way too much stuff in it, and I wish that it was a little more straightforward, but I also appreciate everything that it's doing in a certain light. So I hope that you enjoyed that review. Maybe you got something out of it. Maybe you're approaching the book in a different way. In any case, that's going to do it for this video, so I'll see you in the next one.